Hello again. In this episode, we are returning to our readings from the book What is Man, Adam, Alien, or Ape? Now, in the last episode of this reading series, we began to look at chapter 5, which is all about the multiverse. The idea that our universe, the one in which we live and which we know and can explore, is simply one of a vast number of universes. And this is often appealed to by those who want to avoid the implications of fine-tuning, a subject we looked at previously, and the theological implications, of course, of that observation that the universe is fine-tuned to support life, specially suited, if you like, for the support of life. Well, in our study of the multiverse theory, we first pointed out that there is not one theory of the multiverse, but a significant number of the multiverse. And I ask the question, the multiverse, is it fact or fiction? Well, we've looked at the first two, and now we're going to consider the other. So we pick up the story with a consideration of the third of these multiverse theories, the eternal inflation multiverse. We all know that inflation is a problem in advanced economies, but that's nothing compared to the problem it causes in cosmology, where, of course, it means something completely different. Most experts subscribe to the idea that the universe as we know it began its existence in a so-called Big Bang. But there's a special difficulty with this theory. The Earth is bathed in a cosmic microwave background, which consists of low-frequency radiation coming from space in all directions. It is believed to represent the dying embers of the Big Bang. The interesting thing is that the radiation is amazingly uniform, having the same wavelength and thus the same temperature, regardless of the direction from which it comes. This implies that the temperature of the whole cosmos was also the same everywhere during the Big Bang. But that wouldn't have been possible in a simple model of the expanding universe. Cosmologists therefore introduced a modification known as inflation theory. We'll talk about that later, which solves the problem by invoking the idea that the universe expanded faster than light during a brief early phase of its existence. I have to remind you that although nothing can travel faster than light through space, the theory allows space itself to expand faster than light. But while inflation solved one problem, it created new ones. Writing in Discovery magazine on the 20th of February 2015, physicist Max Tegmark, a keen protagonist of multiverses, nevertheless comments as follows. Physics is all about predicting the future from the past, but inflation seems to sabotage this. When we try to predict the probability that something particular will happen, inflation theory always gives the same useless answer: infinity divided by infinity. The problem is that whatever experiment you make, inflation predicts that there will be infinitely many copies of you far away in our infinite space, obtaining each physically possible outcome. And despite years of tooth grinding in the cosmology community, no consensus has emerged on how to extract sensible answers from these infinities. So, strictly speaking, we physicists are no longer able to predict anything at all. Close quotation. So be warned, the eternal inflation multiverse is built on cosmological quicksand. The theory of inflation was introduced to explain some puzzling features of our universe as we observe it today. Specifically, one, the overall uniformity of the cosmic microwave background, as mentioned above, and secondly, its flatness, as discussed in Chapter 4, and thirdly, the low entropy or highly ordered character of the universe that it must have had at its inception, which also gives rise to the arrow of time, as we discussed in Chapter 8 of my previous book, Who Made God? Briefly, the theory runs as follows. Having started in some unknown way, the universe sat quietly as a tiny seed long enough to attain thermal equilibrium, that is, to have the same temperature everywhere. The space within the seed was suffused by a mysterious inflaton field. Inflaton is not a misprint, but an invented word. A field is something that permeates space invisibly, but has the power to make things happen, like the electromagnetic fields that bring messages to your television or cell phones. Because of this inflaton field, the tiny cosmic seed had the potential to become one or more universes like our own. Just as an acorn has the potential to grow into a mighty oak tree. How did this happen? According to inflation theory, the inflaton field acted like a negative pressure, causing the seed to expand and encompass more space. But because the field was a property of space itself, the more space it created, the greater became the energy it contained. As a result, the total energy of the inflaton field built up exponentially, driving the expansion of space faster and faster until the speed of expansion was orders of magnitude greater than the speed of light. This inflationary phase of the early universe lasted only seconds, but caused the tiny seed to grow to the immeasurable size of our present universe. Subheading: Molehills and volcanoes. That's just the beginning of the story. But let's pause for breath and try to visualize all this by thinking of the birth of a volcano. The volcano begins life no larger than a molehill, but as molten rock or magma is forced up from below and flows out from the volcanic pipe, it solidifies and begins to build a volcanic cone. The magma in this illustration represents the inflaton field, and the growing mountain represents the expanding universe. But now we have to imagine something that doesn't happen with volcanoes, namely that the amount of magma it produces increases in proportion to the size of the mountain. This represents the idea that the total energy of the inflaton field rises in proportion to the amount of space in the universe. The effect is obvious. The growth of our volcano becomes exponential because the bigger it gets, the more magma it produces. This mirrors the exponential growth of space under the influence of the inflaton field. However, sooner or later, the pressure forcing the magma to the surface will be relieved, and although the volcano may still remain active, any further mountain building will be slow. This represents the end of the inflationary phase of the universe. A further point, the growing volcano not only pictures the expanding universe, but also involves solidification of the liquid magma into rock. By analogy, as the growing universe cools, the energy of the inflaton field, in quotes, solidifies, close quotes, into a host of subatomic particles, which constitute the matter and radiation that populate our familiar universe. But doesn't that still leave us with just one universe? Not necessarily, says the eternal inflation scenario. Let's revisit our volcano. Suppose the underground reservoir of magma is in fact unlimited. Suppose also that instead of forcing its way to the surface at one volcano, it erupts through a large number of fissures to create a landscape dotted with volcanoes. And further imagine that this doesn't happen all at once, but that new volcanoes are constantly popping up throughout the unlimited future. Each volcano goes through the sequence I described earlier: molehill, eruption, inflation, cooling, and solidification. And each volcano represents a brand new universe separated from past and present universes by as yet unbroken ground. Hey presto, we have created the eternal inflation multiverse, composed of past, present, and future universes, each of which is unaware that the others exist. You may complain that I've forgotten to tell you exactly what the inflaton field is. I haven't forgotten. It's just that no one has the slightest idea what it is, where it came from, and even whether it actually exists. It might be related in some way to what is called dark energy. But since this is an equally mysterious field, inferred indirectly from its effects, this doesn't really help. Confronted with the shifting sands of eternal inflation theory, I feel like someone invited to climb to a higher level of cosmic comprehension on a ladder of mathematical theory. When the climber points out that most of the rungs are missing from the ladder, his protests are met with an assurance, "Don't worry, the rungs really are there. It's just that they are hypothetical. So, up you go." The verdict: the eternal inflation multiverse fails on account of these missing rungs. What are they? Firstly, there is inflation theory itself. Remember Max Tegmark's statement which began this section. When we try to predict the probability that something particular will happen, inflation always gives the same useless answer. Secondly, the inflaton field, which, along with its hypothesized properties, remains completely unknown as to its physical nature or source. Thirdly, the idea, based on mathematics rather than physics, that an inflationary scenario must be repeated over and over again to provide a multiverse. I advise you to avoid that ladder until some solid rungs are installed. Our fourth multiverse theory I've called the quantum cat multiverse, for reasons which will appear presently. Otherwise known as the quantum multiverse or many worlds hypothesis, this was one of the earliest multiverse proposals, advanced by Hugh Everett in 1955. But before we get to that, let me explain how a cat got into the act. Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, proposed an experiment involving a cat. Fortunately for the cat, it was a thought experiment, and no real cat was involved. In the experiment, a cat is placed in a box along with a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a poison capsule that breaks if the Geiger counter records the arrival of an electron or photon. As long as the radioactive atom remains unobserved, quantum theory deems it to be in a superposition of states, in which during a given interval of time it has both 1. Remained undecayed, and 2. Has decayed, releasing an electron or photon. In case 1, of course, the cat comes to no harm, but in case 2, the Geiger counter is activated, the poison released, and the cat is dead. But until the box is opened, Schrödinger maintained the unobserved cat is also in a superposition of states, being both dead and alive at the same time. Only when an observer opens the box does the cat's wave function, which describes superimposed quantum states, collapse to reveal either a live cat or a dead one, but not both. Schrödinger's aim was to show that such a ridiculous outcome must signify that quantum mechanics was at that time an incomplete theory. However, it was quickly pointed out that the activation of the Geiger counter is itself an act of observation. Wave functions don't necessarily need a conscious observer to make them collapse into a single reality. Nevertheless, Schrödinger's cat lives on, so to speak, and the cat paradox is still debated today. The reason I tell the story is this. It is the nature of atomic and subatomic quantum systems to exist in superimposed states until something happens to make their wave functions collapse into one or other of the states. When collapse occurs, there is no longer any uncertainty about the state of the system, which behaves in a classical manner, meaning it is no longer subject to quantum effects. Wave function collapse can be caused by an experimental observation of a quantum system or by interaction with other particles. This is called decoherence, which routinely happens when the quantum system is just part of some larger object. However, the cause of wave function collapse is still a mystery and the subject of much debate. Everett's solution to the problem was radical. He suggested that the wave function never actually collapses into one or other of their superimposed states, but that both states live on in different worlds. Thus, in one world, the cat is alive, and in the other world, the cat is dead. Every time any quantum system seems to suffer a wave function collapse, he claimed that a split occurs and two new worlds are created, in each of which one of the originally superimposed states survives. If Everett was right, you have probably created a zillion new worlds as your quantum-controlled brain solves puzzle over this last paragraph. You will never know, of course, since the many different worlds so created are beyond our reach, and we cannot communicate with them as they go their separate ways in an ever-growing multiverse. However, in David Deutsch's version of the many worlds hypothesis, there is some weak interaction between adjacent universes, which he calls interferences, that might explain some of the strange effects of quantum mechanics in any one universe. So, apart from offering a highly exotic explanation of wave function collapse and of certain other mysteries of quantum theory, including quantum computing, what is the point of the quantum multiverse, seeing that there are alternative explanations of these things? Deutsch argues that he is seeking the ultimate truth, and that his many worlds multiverse really does represent what he calls the fabric of reality. But here are some of the problems with his claim. Firstly, it leads us down the yellow brick road of science fiction rather than truth. According to John Gribbin, Deutsch believes that universes in which dinosaurs have developed cities, space probes, and computers using silicon-based microchips, quote, undoubtedly, close quotes, exist. because that's what the laws of physics tells us. Close quotes from Deutsch. I have italicized the last statement for two reasons. One, it isn't true, and two, it exemplifies a faulty argument that frequently lies in the multiverse scenarios we have looked at. This argument can be loosely summarized as follows. Quotes again. If I can devise an elegant mathematical formula that describes some unobservable entity, then that entity must exist, even if no possible experiment could prove it. Close quotes. As physicist Lee Smolin warns, lots of beautiful scientific theories have turned out to have nothing to do with nature. The second problem with Deutsch's and Everett's many worlds hypothesis is that it dehumanizes man. If you visit a hall of mirrors, you may find two full-length mirrors facing each other and set strictly parallel, so that if you stand between the mirrors, you will see in each mirror an apparently infinite series of your own reflections. However, there is only one real you. All the other images are truly imaginary. But in Deutsch's multiverse, his innumerable alter egos are as real as himself. It's no use asking, please, will the real David Deutsch stand up? Because there is no real person, that is, someone with a definable identity, to respond. He claims that in another universe, he might not be a scientist. Presumably he could be a taxi driver or a fishmonger, or might ridicule the very idea of the multiverse. Alternatively, he could be a rapist or a murderer, or even a computer-literate dinosaur. Why not? In the quantum multiverse, anything goes. So who or what exactly is David Deutsch? In his multiverse, he exists only as an option, not as a person. I would prefer to think more highly of him and everyone else than that. Verdict. The quantum multiverse fails firstly because, although it offers an explanation of certain observed quantum effects, albeit an extravagant one, its predictions also embrace nonsensical science fiction scenarios. Secondly, it dehumanizes man by confusing and ultimately destroying the identity of individual persons. An overall failure. Exponents of multiverse theories give their books grandiose titles like The Fabric of Reality, that's of Deutsch, and The Hidden Reality, Green, and The Grand Design, Hawking. But they rapidly get lost in a jungle of unreality. It has been said that neurotics build castles in the air, psychotics live in them, and psychiatrists collect the rent. Scientists who urge upon us the, quote, reality of their mathematical castles in the air are neither neurotics nor psychotics, though they might, of course, be psychiatrists. They are among the most intelligent people. But their supposed realities, when examined in the cold light of day, turn out to be mirages masquerading as science. They certainly do nothing to advance our understanding of ourselves, but serve only to dehumanize man, with the added unintended consequences of casting doubt on the rationality of science and on the validity of their own thought processes. So why do they do it? The one common factor is a determination to exclude from their worldviews any truth of, quotes, God, who made the world and all that is in it, and in whom, quotes again, we live and move and have our being, close quotes. Those quotes are taken from the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 24 and 28. We won't find the answer to the question, what is man, in the multiversal supermarket, so we had better look elsewhere.